There.
We live?
Oh, we are live. Welcome, everybody, and welcome, Dan, to Ideas on the Verge. And before we get started, I just got to say a quick word from the sponsor, New Society Publishers. There. New Society Publishers. Hearing some double feedback there. New Society Publishers is proud to be celebrating 40 years of activist solutions-oriented publishing. From the roots in nonviolent civil disobedience training during the Vietnam War to today, they continue to bring positive solutions and cutting-edge ideas to some of the most troubling challenges of our time. Committed to building an ecologically and sustainable and just society, they walk their talk by printing their books in North America, never overseas, on 100% post-consumer recycled paper. They are a carbon neutral business and have been since 2006. Their employees are shareholders and they are a certified B Corporation. If you'd like to find more out about New Society, head on over to www.newsociety.com. And today I have a super rad guest, Dr. Dan Chiras, and he is the author of an eclectic array of books regarding self-sufficiency, including, but not limited to, solar home heating basics, wind power basics, green transportation basics, solar electricity basics, the scoop on poop, Superbia, the Homeowner's Guide to Renewable Energy, and his latest book, The Chinese Greenhouse: Design and Build a Low-Cost Passive Solar Greenhouse. And further, Dan is the director of the Evergreen Institute in East Central Missouri, where he teaches workshops on self-sufficiency and sustainability topics and is the president of Sustainable Systems Design. Dan, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much. Good to be here.
Awesome. That's my first question for you is how the heck did you get here? Your journey and to be an author of more than 30 books is incredible. So like, do you sleep upside down or something? How did you?
I usually sleep every once in a while. Yeah. It's funny because a few years ago I published my 12th book, and I thought, I'm out of ideas. I don't know. I don't know what else to write about. And I went through about 2 weeks, and it's like, oh my God, I'm just at the end of my rope. And then I said, oh, how about this? And then next thing I know, I've got 28 more books under my belt. So I'm just inspired by what's going on. I started out as a reproductive physiologist. That my graduate degree is a PhD in reproductive physiology from the University of Kansas Medical School. And but while I was in medical school, I started reading books like Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, and I started reading, some of Desmond Morris's books, and I became really interested in the environment. And so, I was headed down that academic line. And in fact, I was even accepted to medical school when I finished my PhD. But by then I had developed such an interest in environmental issues. It just drew me in. I don't know, it was just a magnetic force that I couldn't resist. And it just absolutely intrigued me. I was appalled by what we were doing to our planet. And so that's kind of what still drives me forward. And I think if there's any reason why I've done what I've done, it's just this fervent desire to help people understand what the problems are. But more importantly, I've spent most of my career saying, here are the solutions. Here's what we can do. Let's not wring our hands and say, oh my God, we're doomed. How do we compost human manure? How can you grow food in your own home? How can you make your home more energy efficient? How can we as individuals do all these things to live more sustainably?
And so how did you learn all this? Where did you just consume every book and every that you could find from?
Yeah, I basically just started reading. I was very fortunate when I taught at the University of Colorado. I was assigned a certain number of courses. I had to teach cell biology, and I had to teach endocrinology course, and I had to teach an advanced graduate level course in reproductive physiology. But they said, Dan, if you want to teach anything else on an overflow or an overload, you're welcome to do it. So I started teaching little 1-hour science modules on pollution, environment, and health, and basically just read everything I could get my hands on, every book that I could, and I continue to read enormously. So I'm really self-taught in all these areas, like so many of us are. We just, when you want to learn something, buy 10 books on it and sit down and read them. And I always tell, being an academic, students come to me all the time. Well, I'd like to get a degree in solar energy. And I say, well, don't waste your time. Go get 10 books, read them, memorize them, and get an internship, do some hands-on workshops. You don't need a college degree to do that. There's just so much information out there.
Yeah, it's almost too much information. It's really hard these days to filter out, and having this overwhelm, this paradox of choice, like, oh, I could do this, I could do that, but it really just comes down to sitting down, focusing, and memorizing, and then getting your hands dirty.
And giving it a try. I mean, over the years, I've tried almost everything I've ever written about. I've tried more than once, and so you learn a lot from your failures. And that's one of the things I promised in all my books is I will tell people what I've done that didn't work, so they don't make the same mistakes. So it's embarrassing at times, the stupid things that we've done. But it's like, well, but I don't want you to make that mistake.
Yeah, and that's just how we all learn. It's just and passing those along and hoping people don't repeat them.
Right.
So what are some of the challenges that you have faced in this line of work? Like, you've been at this for a pretty long time. I imagine there were a lot of challenges in your way, and also a lot of people being skeptical of what you were doing. So how did you overcome these challenges?
There were a lot of challenges. First is just being heard. Americans aren't really, how shall I say this diplomatically, aren't really advanced thinkers, forward thinkers. Forward thinkers would be the word. We don't, our idea of the long-term future is like, hey, what's for dinner? And maybe what's our midnight snack going to be? We're not really good at that. And maybe that's true of people throughout the world. I don't know, but that's been one of the biggest challenges, is being able to just talking to people about things that are unfolding over decades, over hundreds of years, being concerned about 7 generations from now, and just I've got a dog here growling, and just hey, Linda, would you mind? We got a girlie. She doesn't like her other dog. So just that's been a hard thing, is get people to wake up and say, listen, draw this line. Here's population growth. Here's where we are now, and here's where we're going to be in 10 years, and here's where we're going to be in 20 years. What's that mean? So that's been a real challenge, is being able to engage people, to convince them that we need to act now in advance. And there's been a lot of skepticism, and I think that's more recent than anything else with the Trump administration. There's just been people I meet people all the time say, oh, I'm a climate change skeptic. And I say, well, why is that? Well, I just don't believe it's real. And well, why don't you believe it's real? Well, I don't believe it's real. Well, what's your science? You have nothing to back it up. And I always say, well, you're talking to the wrong guy. I used to teach courses on this stuff, and they're very open to it. They're very open to the facts. Yeah. And that's been more of a challenge in recent years, is just this backlash toward science and toward forward thinking, and other than what's for lunch.
Yeah, I'm a climatologist, and that is definitely a point of contention in central Alberta and a lot of places in Canada. I think everywhere it's really hard. It's difficult to navigate those kind of conversations.
Yeah, I think people are just naturally, biologically, psychologically, we're short-term thinkers. I used to teach a course on sustainable policy at the University of Denver, and it was a graduate course, and it went over 5 weeks, so it was really intense. And it took me 5 weeks to get the students to finally get out of that mindset that we're not talking about more regulations. We're talking about preventing problems rather than cleaning them up afterwards. And that's really what sustainability is about. It's about crafting a lifestyle, crafting systems of transportation and housing and energy that don't create the problems. So we don't have to, put expensive pollution control devices on power plants and whatnot. As we generate electricity in a manner that's clean. We produce food in a manner that doesn't poison our wildlife and our streams and our drinking water. And you know what I'm talking. I mean, I'm sure all the listeners know what the heck we're talking about is prevention. But in that 5-week course, they're just these people who are all master's degree students were so steeped in the traditional paradigm. It's owls versus jobs, for example. It's one or the other. And I kept saying, no, it's owls and jobs. How do we do both? And so I asked one of my students, I said, why is it so hard for these students to break down those mental barriers, break and view a new paradigm? And she said, well, she says that you're like a hawk, Dan. You fly up here and you see things in the big picture. He said, we're like little mice running around, what's for dinner? Where's that little piece of grain going to come from? And she didn't mean it in a derogatory fashion. It was just that I think that's where a lot of people are. We're never really taught to think long term. We're never taught in school to think in terms of systems. It's almost A causes B, not A might A, B, C, D, and E might cause F. We're never really taught to think critically, and we're never really taught to think in terms of systems, holistic, which is really what permaculture is all about. It's about thinking in terms of whole systems. How do you make this human system fit within the system of nature? Within that natural, the life support system of a planet.
Yeah, absolutely. That's been my experience as well. Is it's been very siloed, and we're presented with a lot of problems.
Yeah.
But very little solutions. So thank you, applaud you for presenting your students with solutions, because that is such a, I've been talking to a lot of people who've done the same degree as me, and it's difficult because we just get a word vomit of problems, and then, okay, there's your degree.
Yeah.
That's what it is. So it's pretty difficult. So thanks for that.
And Mitch, I ran into this. I wrote an environmental science textbook back in the 1980s. That's been through like 10 editions now. And when I started, it was a very traditional. It was like, okay, there's a chapter on air pollution. There's a chapter on species extinction. There's a chapter on population. There's a chapter on farm agricultural problems. Each chapter, here are the problems. And then every solution was very traditional. All the solutions were, well, you attack it this way. We dealt with each problem as if it was a separate problem.
Mm-hmm.
And after a couple editions of that, I got to thinking, this isn't right. It's just like someone coming into a doctor's office and they've got multiple problems, and we'll put a Band-Aid here, we'll put a poultice here and give them a pill for that. But if there's something systematically wrong,
mm-hmm.
if we're living unsustainably, then all those systems, you're going to have all those manifestations. But the problem isn't that you've got a cut in your knee. The problem is something deeper. It's it's fundamentally how we're living. And so I started to rewrite. I rewrote that textbook to talk about, well, here are the traditional solutions. And now, as a sustainable society, if we really want to address air pollution, we have to do these things. We have to think systemically. We have to go to root level causes and root level solutions. We have to address those fundamentals. So anyway.
And while we attack or address those fundamentals, we might just find that we actually fix a lot of other problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you eat right. Well, here's a good example from the human nutrition. If you eat right and stay in relatively decent shape, you dramatically lower your chances of high blood pressure, elevated cholesterol, hardening of the arteries, atherosclerosis, heart attacks, strokes, and that's a classic example right there. And it's taught. We don't give you a medicine for your high blood pressure or high cholesterol. If you address it at that root cause,
mm-hmm.
at that root level, and that's what we need to do with the environment too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk to you about your newest book, Chinese Greenhouses, which, by the way, the most engaged viewer will get a free copy of. So make sure you get those questions in, and we'll ask Dan all about them at the end of this chat. But what's wrong with conventional greenhouses first? I guess let's take a look at one of the root problems, and what's wrong with how greenhouses are built now.
Well, greenhouses are built fine for what they do. If you want to start things in the spring in your greenhouse, maybe grow over the summer and a little into the fall, it's fine, but you can't grow through the winter in a conventional greenhouse.
Mhm.
If it's 10 degrees Celsius outside, it's 10 degrees Celsius inside your greenhouse. And so it's difficult to grow. It's difficult to grow warm weather vegetables year round in a conventional greenhouse. So, that I don't like to slam greenhouses, but conventional greenhouses. It's just that they're very limited in what you can do with them. And certainly, if you want to grow year round, they're not designed well at all for that. You could use a conventional greenhouse to grow cold weather vegetables, for example, throughout the winter by just little hoop houses within the greenhouse. You have a conventional greenhouse, and then you plant inside the greenhouse and then put little hoop houses over those plantings, whether it's raised bed or in the soil. That's a wonderful way. We've done that. My wife and I've done that for many years. It's called the Four Seasons greenhouse, and we've done that. But you're very limited to growing things like arugula and kale and Swiss chard and lettuce and things like that can handle colder weather. But you're never going to grow a tomato. You're never going to grow a cucumber. You're never going to grow a green pepper. And so, basically, if you want to adapt one of those greenhouses to grow year round, you're going to have a monster energy bill. You're going to have to pump in some form of heat, whether it's wood or propane or electricity. You're going to spend a fortune, heating that greenhouse because they're not insulated whatsoever. I mean, it's about the least energy efficient structure that human beings have ever designed, really. I mean, maybe a tent is worse, tent than greenhouse. They're really close to each other, but clearly not something that's designed to be heated or cooled very easily. They're typically, for winter growing, they're oriented wrong. And most greenhouses in the United States are oriented on a north-south axis. If you want to grow in the winter, you really need to flip that around. The long axis needs to run east and west. And that's just to take advantage of that low-angled winter sun. So they don't have any, they're basically all glass or all plastic, uninsulated, super uninsulated, costly to heat, oriented wrong for winter growing. And they also lack thermal mass. They don't, if the sun does shine on a winter day, greenhouses will typically, a conventional greenhouse will get pretty warm. And what a lot of people do is they open the vents to let the heat out because it's too hot for the plants. And if those greenhouses were designed with something to capture that heat, they'd function better. So that's another problem, is they're not designed with thermal mass in mind, with thermal mass that's able to capture that daytime heat and release it at night. So that's really some of the problems for those of us who want to grow year round, who want to continue growing through the winter. And I mean, here's an example. Here it is, the middle of January. We just picked 2 celebrity tomatoes from our Chinese greenhouse, and that greenhouse has no supplemental heating. It's just a earth sheltered greenhouse that never gets below 50 degrees. No matter how cold it is, it never gets below 50 degrees in the winter. And that's suitable for growing quite a lot of warm weather vegetables. Yeah.
So what makes a Chinese greenhouse so special? What do they offer that conventional greenhouse houses don't?
Basically, they offer you the ability to grow warm weather vegetables in the off season. You can grow all the cold weather stuff through the winter too, but the advantage is if you want to grow tomatoes or peppers or cucumbers or squash through the winter, then that's the chief advantage. They allow us to grow warm weather vegetables throughout that off season, late fall, winter, and early spring. They allow us to grow in that time frame when most greenhouses are shut down. Certainly all our outdoor gardens are shut down. So they allow us to do that without supplemental heat, using only solar energy. There's no propane stoves, no $1,000 a month heating bills to try to keep it up to temperature. And that's the chief advantage. If you want to grow that kind of vegetable, if you want to pick a fresh garden salad or a fresh tomato in January or a fresh pepper in February or March. It gives you that opportunity.
Fantastic. And so what's the history of Chinese greenhouses? Where did you get introduced to them?
I was teaching at a little college in Iowa, and a gentleman, Sanjung Gu, who's Chinese, but he's here, American citizen. He is a agricultural specialist at North Carolina, and he was there just visiting for the day. And I happened to sit down next to him in the cafeteria, and he started talking to me about it. And the Chinese have a huge problem, is that obviously a massive population, and they're looking for ways to produce their own food throughout the winter. And that's where this greenhouse came about. They realized that they could earth shelter these things. And by earth shelter, basically dig it down into the earth, so it's kind of nestled into the earth. The same thing we do with a lot of passive solar homes. We nestle them into the earth. They realized that they could do this and continue to grow all these vegetables locally instead of having to import them from other areas. They could grow these locally. And so that started back in the 1980s. And they were extremely successful, extraordinarily successful in growing vegetables without, expensive fuel bills. So I learned from Sanjung Gu. I talked him into coming to my class. I was teaching a course on ecological design, basically how you design systems with, ecological principles, with with our ecology in mind. How do we design all these systems? What principles from ecology can we use to design human systems, and how can those two systems work? So he came in, graciously gave a talk, and bless his heart, he gave me his slideshows, and it just so interested me. As soon as the spring came, I started digging, excavating to build one, and I was just thrilled and tried to read everything I could on the subject. And there wasn't much at the time; there was very, very little. So I basically just plunged right into it, because it's the idea of being able to grow through the winter just really excited me.
That's incredible. So you just started your own without any plans, or did he give you some plans, or do you
I had drawings. He had some real crude drawings, but I just drew up a set of plans on my own. I actually started one, and then I abandoned it. It was going to be way too small. I started digging, I excavated for one, and I thought, this is not going to be big enough. So then it was in 2007 or 2017. Yeah, I rented some equipment, some heavier excavation equipment. We excavated a huge one and just proceeded to build it, with a very simple drawing on graph paper. It was a lot of design by the seat of the pants. You get to a place and go, oh, we didn't anticipate that. What do we do now? There's a lot of Ozark hillbilly framing. Fortunately, you can't see. It's behind the walls. And if ever any of my construction friends saw it, they'd be shaking their heads, but it works. It's solid. Yeah, so I've been very fortunate. I had some interns that have come from a local college and helped build it. Lots of people very, very interested to come and help build it, and hired a number of people who, over the years, it took us 3 years to build it. We didn't start at the beginning and just work straight through, but it took us 3 years to get it completely done. And we built it out of rammed earth tires, which was probably our first mistake, because they're very, very labor intensive. And if I were to do it again, there are other materials I'd use, believe me.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. So I'm just enamored by the fact that you just went straight for it and just did it. What were the things that you discovered along the way in your first build that you wouldn't do? And I guess there would be some people watching this right now who might not have an idea of the fundamentals of a Chinese greenhouse. Could you just the fundamentals? What makes a Chinese greenhouse a Chinese?
Let's cover that first too. And I should say I plunged into it, but I built an earth sheltered home in Colorado. Okay. And so I had some experience with rammed earth tires, and I've done a lot of carpentry. So I wasn't just jumping into it as a neophyte. I had some experience. There still was this very steep learning curve. But here's what a Chinese greenhouse is. If you could define it, it's oriented east and west. That's the first thing. It's typically earth sheltered. That's the most important thing you can do is earth sheltering. And that helps keep it cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. You know, earth isn't a good insulator, but the temperature, once you get below the frost line, the temperature of the earth stays a fairly constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're capitalize on that natural warmth, if you will, to shelter it, to moderate and modulate the temperature inside it. So it's an east-west structure. Most of the glazing, the glass or plastic, is on the south side. It's not a conventional greenhouse where you have glass go all the way over the top. It's really built very much like a passive solar home. Mm-hmm. So that's the other advantage. I'd been designing passive solar homes forever, and I wrote a book on it called The Solar House, which is passive solar. So I had all that information too. But you really design it very much like a passive solar home. Orient it east-west, concentrate your glazing, or your just a fancy word for glass or whatever is letting light in on the south side. Insulate the daylights out of it, because when you get that heat in there, and we've got a day tomorrow, I think it's going to be, I know, practically close to zero, but the sun's going to be out, and that greenhouse will be nice and toasty. So insulate everything that doesn't have glass. Insulate. I mean, we have 12-inch thick walls filled with insulation, and then we put a layer of insulation over those. So insulate the heck out of it, make it airtight. Most greenhouses aren't. And then the other feature is to include thermal mass, something inside that building that's solid, that has the capacity to store heat. It could be, in our case, it's tires filled with packed filled with dirt, and then we've got a 3 or 4 inch layer of earth and plaster over them. So we've got when the sun comes in and it warms that greenhouse, some of that heat ends up in this thermal mass. And then at night, when the sun goes down, that mass radiates the heat into the room, allowing us to keep that greenhouse a lot cooler during the day and warmer at night. So those are really the basics. That's the basics. Now, as to things I do differently, I wouldn't do rammed earth tires again. And that's partly, I built a house in Colorado, a rammed earth tire home in Colorado. We had 800 tires, and we had a crew of 4, and we packed those tires using a pneumatic tamping device, and we were able to do that in a week. We did it all by hand with sledgehammers, and we had wicked wet, rainy weather, and it made our very clay-rich dirt almost impossible to deal with. So in the future, I would pour a concrete wall or use those big bin blocks, those big solid concrete blocks. I'd use something like that. We'd have the foundation up in 5 days, and then have it framed in another week. But that's something that I would definitely do differently. Is that I would find a material that's faster and easier to build with. Well, and one thing too that, Mitch, I should mention is a lot of people are thinking, well, it's earth sheltered, but my lot's pretty flat. How can I do that? But there are ways. Since you're going down into the earth, you can remove that dirt. If you go down a couple of feet and your greenhouse is going to sink into that dirt that you remove can be bermed around the sides and the back of the greenhouse. So you really don't need a 10-degree slope or a 5-degree slope, or if your property is pretty flat, you can still do this. You can still achieve that.
Yeah. I imagine there's differences in different jurisdictions, but do you need to send your design to get stamped or to make sure it's safe, or are there
I didn't out here. I did not have to get any engineering stamp. We do for buildings like houses and anything over 300 square feet, but for greenhouses and buildings like that, it was not required. It really depends on your jurisdiction.
Cool. What do you think are the limitations or challenges going ahead to get people, like, why doesn't everyone have a Chinese greenhouse? Is it a matter of education? Is it a matter of just being open-minded to doing something different? What are the barriers there?
Well, you're answering the question. It's engaging people, in getting them to know that it even exists.
Yeah.
Everywhere you look, there are conventional greenhouses. So that's one of the big issues. educating them so they understand the benefits. And it's not an inexpensive option either, and if you, and there are limitations. If you live in the suburbs or in a city with a very tiny lot, you're very likely not going to be able to do it. You need a little bit more elbow room. So I think that's a limitation. But I think too, there's a credibility gap, is that people find it really hard to believe that you could actually do this, that you can actually grow tomatoes through the winter without spending a fortune.
Yeah.
I remember I was in Montana years ago, and I went into this little greenhouse, and they told me they had a fuel bill just for this little dinky thing about the size of an entry when it was like $300 or $400 a month. And I got turned off to greenhouse growing back then. I thought, oh, I'm never going to do that. That's just too wasteful. But when you learn about this Chinese greenhouse, then it provides a great option. So I think that's one of those are some of the barriers. The cost is a big issue. You could spend $10,000, $20,000 building one, depending on the size. And I think too, Mitch, in all honesty, there are other ways to grow food. If you just want to grow for your family, there are other ways to do it that aren't quite so expensive. We've been growing indoors a lot, and we've been growing a lot of stuff indoors in hydroponics. And we use this technique. I'll show you. I brought some here. We use this method called the Kratky method. It's a 1 quart canning jar, and it's filled with a nutrient solution. And you see that all right?
Yeah.
And we're growing lettuce in our bedroom under an LED grow light. And here's an arugula, and it's passive hydroponics. It's just a 1 quart canning jar with a nutrient solution that you can buy for like hydroponics. And we use a net pot, and that's filled with, I can't show you, but that's filled with these little tiny clay pellets. And we grow in that. So I wouldn't necessarily encourage everybody to go out and build a greenhouse unless they really want to grow a lot of food. I mean, if you want to grow a lot of food for your family, if you want, and we grow food for ourselves, but we also grow for farmers markets and for a CSA. So for us, the Chinese greenhouse made sense. It provides a lot more room than we have in our house to grow hydroponically. But so there are other options too that I would encourage people to look at too. I'm not just I just showed them these. My wife wanted to bring some in to show them. I'm ahead of you, darling. Thank you, dear. My supporting cast here, my producer. So yeah, there are ways, and I suggest people take a real good look at that. It's called the Kratky method. And I'm actually writing a book on that right now with a gentleman who manufactures the lights that we're using for this. It's a neat way of growing a lot of things indoors.
Cool.
So,
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I don't want to say don't build a Chinese greenhouse, but think about what your needs are. If you're thinking, and you've got a little bit of a room, say room in your house or your apartment for a bookshelf, you can grow on a baker's rack or something like that, and grow quite a lot of food indoors. If you want to produce a lot of food, which we do, and we use it to feed our chickens in the winter. We use, when we trim out plants, or we get some bolt, for example, we'll throw it into the chickens. And if you want to grow a lot of food for your family, or if you want to grow for local restaurants, then a Chinese greenhouse is a great idea. It's a terrific idea.
Amazing. And was there a sock on that?
Yes.
So what's the function of the sock? Is that to block out light, or?
Yeah, don't throw away all those extra socks. I did laundry the other day, and I had 5 unmatched black socks. Now, how does that happen?
I don't know.
Where do they go? I think scientists are going to find when they finally peer inside a black hole, that's where they're all ending up. All our black socks are in those black holes. The idea behind that is because this is a nutrient-rich medium. Okay, that's a nutrient. Look at the roots on that sucker. If light shines on, algae will grow. So I like these little ankle socks. I just put these ankle socks on the jar to keep the light out, and that keeps the algae from growing inside.
Stacking functions.
Yeah, it has a function, and it also kind of looks pretty too.
Yeah. And so is there a name of the solution that you put in there in case anyone's watching and they want to
Yeah,
mimic?
there's a website, there's a couple of websites. There's one called Happy Leaf LED, happyleafled.com. They've got a little introductory booklet on this growing technique. And we use their lights. I use these, this is one of their smaller lights. We use these lights in the greenhouse too for all our production. And I should say, Mitch, in that greenhouse, we're growing in soil. About half the greenhouse is soil, and the other half is aquaponics. So we have a pretty big farm pond, and so in the spring I'll catch some bluegills and bass, and I've got them in a big 275-gallon tank in there. We feed the fish, and then the waste from that flows through a series of growing chambers, and that's what we grow on. So we grow a lot of stuff in there. We got great lettuce growing in there now, and this particular tomato plant is growing in hydroponics right now.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you said one of the disadvantages is you need to have a lot of space and it could cost quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
What are there any other disadvantages that you can really think of?
Yeah, to be real honest, it's a little hard. It's very hard to keep the temperature down in the summer. We like to grow in there year round. And keeping the temperature from getting too high is a challenge. Now, we've been playing with this. We've operated ours for 3 years now. We've had 3 full years of growth in it. And I should back up to say that what a lot of people don't understand is that when plants get to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever that is in Celsius, when they get to that temperature, photosynthesis starts to slow down. And by the time you reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit, photosynthesis pretty much stops. So you have to be really careful growing in a greenhouse in the summer that it doesn't get too hot. And we've addressed that for 3 years in a row. We've tried to find ways to keep that temperature under 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And this last summer was very, very successful. We put a wind scoop, we installed a wind scoop, and there's a picture of it. There's a picture of it in the last page of my book, a wind scoop that just basically it's 2 6-inch PVC pipes. Yeah, I don't know if you can see that, but 2 6-inch PVC pipes. Can you see that?
Oh, yeah.
And they basically go up about 7 feet over the greenhouse. And we get a lot of breezes. We're on top of a hill. We chose this site very carefully because there's a natural breeze. And so that scoops up that cooler wind and just runs it through the greenhouse and helps keep it cooler. And we've also set up some fans, solar powered fans. We've built a little solar array with some modules that I installed on my home in Colorado in 1996. And they're little 50-watt modules that we eventually took down and put a bigger system in. So we're using those, and they actually drive some fans. They help circulate the air, blow air in and blow air out of the greenhouse. And then we've started using a shade cloth called Illuminate. And that's really helped us a lot. It blocks out the product we use blocks out about 30% of the sun. And we were able to keep that temperature from 90 degrees Fahrenheit or lower all summer long. So it allowed us to continue to grow in there during the winter. So during the summer. So growing in a real sunny, hot environment would be really tricky in there in the summer. So, and then again, like I'd mentioned earlier, Mitch, that's one of the advantages of earth sheltering it. Because if that greenhouse is down into the ground, it's like your basement in your home. It could be 110 degrees outside in the summer, but it's going to be 70 degrees in that basement. So that's one of the tricks we use to try to keep the greenhouse cooler in the summer. Now, this book isn't just about Chinese greenhouses. What I try to do is discuss ways that you can kind of I don't know, supersize isn't the right word, but turbocharge them. And we developed a system that works really well in the summer. And it's a series of pipes that run in the floor. The floor is all gravel. We have a series of 3-inch PVC pipes that run through there. So you can imagine every 3 feet apart, there's this 3-inch pipe that runs from one end to the other. And what we do is we have 2 vertical pipes fitted with a little solar powered fan So when the sun comes out, it turns that fan on and it takes the hot air from the ceiling and drives it underground, puts it underground, cools it off. And that also helps keep the greenhouse cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. So we're just basically removing the hot air from the greenhouse itself, putting it underground where it cools, and that's helped us cool the greenhouse as well. And that, go ahead, sorry.
You're building a climate battery, so is that?
Exactly, precisely what it is.
And so
we wanted to even install a deeper one so that we could take like that really hot air in the summer and pump it 6 or 8 feet down and then call on that during the winter. But we went down 6 feet and we hit solid rock. I mean, we hit limestone. I said, well, that's the end of that. I'm not gonna blast that out.
What about humidity? Are there any issues with humidity? I imagine ventilation would be a bit of an issue.
It is. And you know what? The first mistake I made, Mitch, is I planted every square inch of that greenhouse. I mean, I had plants in there everywhere. And we ended up with a lot of problems with the humidity. And we developed this, I guess it's a fungus called a soot. It's a black fungus that grows on things. And that attacked, we've got some grapefruit trees and banana trees and orange trees growing in our greenhouse, and it really hit them hard. It just covered the leaves. And that was simply because, one, I've got the aquaponics in there, so there's a lot of moisture from that. And two, thinking I'm just going to use every square inch of that greenhouse, there wasn't much airflow. So I have learned to move things out and installed a lot of fans powered by that solar system that when the sun comes out, they just blow air around the plants to keep them dry. And that's helped a lot. So the humidity has been an issue, good point. And the primary issue for that has been mold, that fungal kinds of issues with plants. We've been able to address that by spacing and by the fans. We have quite a set of fans, those little dash fans that truckers use, those little silver dash fans. We've got those mounted on the posts in there above the plants and just keep the air moving. And we have had some problems with insects as well. As any greenhouse grower will tell you, it's a lovely environment for greenhouse. And we've had issues with scale, we've had issues with aphids, and we've had issues with white flies, and we're still learning how to keep them under control. And we use soap sprays, and if you keep at it at a regular basis, that helps. We don't use any insecticides, any synthetic, as you would expect. We don't use any of that stuff. We've brought ladybugs in to help us from time to time, and we've also learned when you get a plant that's got some bugs on it, get it out of there and don't leave it and just sacrifice it. Get it the heck out of your greenhouse because they'll spread from that one. Yeah. And the thing that we're starting to work now, Mitch, is I'm growing in my hydroponics. I'm growing a bunch of basil, and I'm growing some marigolds that we're now going to interspace throughout that whole greenhouse. So we're going to have a lot of flowers in there, and basil gives off a pungent odor that is presumably, helps repel bugs. We'll see. But so we're taking all that holistic approach to try to control bugs, and air movement helps control insects as well. Good, solid, strong air movement across plants will help. The Amish do that all the time. You go into an Amish greenhouse and they got 4 big fans, one in each corner, just blowing, and that helps really control insects. So all of that has been a big issue. We lost our tomato crop last January, tomato and green pepper crop in February of last year because of scale and that soot, that bacteria, that fungus I was telling you about.
Yeah.
So that's been a problem, moisture, and I don't think it'd be anywhere near as big a problem as if we didn't have the aquaponics. We've got 8 250-gallon tanks in there with water. So there's a lot of water. We're using rafts, so that helps reduce the evaporation of the polystyrene rafts that the pots are set in. and that helps reduce it. But I know the fact that we've got all that water in there makes it more challenging too.
Yeah, lots of water, lots of heat, lots of water vapor.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
I imagine your house, especially with all the books that you've written, to be a very cool Ecolab.
Oh yeah.
Then the lettuces in the jars. What other cool projects are you currently working on?
Well, we just never stop around here, but we've done on this farm since we've moved here. We've put in multiple solar systems and a wind turbine. And we've even made some of our own wind turbines. But we have rain catchment on all the buildings. We raise some grass-fed beef, and so we have rain catchment on our barns for beef. We have a really, really small herd. We're actually getting out of the business, but we catch rainwater off the roof. We have a pond that is there to provide food in case of disaster. We put a lot of food up. We can and freeze vegetables every year. The surplus that we don't sell at the farmer's market, we put those up. I drive an electric car. It's powered entirely by solar and wind. And we actually, one of the first projects we did here is we converted a Chevy S10 to electricity. We ripped out its motor and anything having to do with internal combustion, and we put in a electric motor and battery bank in there. So that was a fun little project. Very, very challenging for someone who didn't know anything about automobiles.
Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot, but I had some really good helpers.
Oh, that's fantastic. What resources did you employ to get that going? You've certainly got it just like, oh, I'm going to do this now. I'm going to go figure it out. But
yeah,
there's a lot of people who just want to do that. So how did you do that?
There was an excellent book on it, and I can't think of the authors' names right now, but there were a couple in California had an excellent book on it, and I read and reread that, and then I worked with my brother-in-law who knows a lot about automobiles. He's got a degree in electrical engineering too. So between the two of us, we could figure out almost everything. And I bought a kit to do it as well, so I didn't have to go out piecemeal and buy this part and this part. I bought a kit that came with everything we needed. Then the challenge became, how do we mount the electric motor? How do we mount all this other hardware that goes with it, the controller and various and sundry things that go with it? How do you mount all that? And it took us a while, but we got it. We had to basically cut out the bed of the pickup truck, cut the floor out, and weld some big baskets to hold the batteries, which sank down below the bed, so we could, and they didn't go completely below the bed, but enough that we could still use the bed. We didn't want to have a bed full of batteries, so we cut out the bottom and built these really heavy duty steel boxes to hold the batteries in, and then built an aluminum covering for it so we could still throw lumber in there or feed or anything else we needed to. That was great, and there were some good videos out on it, and I'm sure there's more information on it now.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Yeah. Recently, one of our recent projects is that we have converted our landscaping around here. We don't have much lawn. We tend to leave everything for the bugs and birds and bees and things. So we have converted our front lawn and our side lawn into an orchard. So we're now growing pears and peaches and apples and I guess that's pretty much it. But so you basically turned our yard, instead of a lawn, it's really a productive orchard now. That's been one of the things we've been working on, and I'm still learning a lot about that. I still got a lot to learn about growing fruit trees.
Yeah. When I was getting prepared for a conversation, I was doing a bunch of reading, and I came across one statement that said, "You haven't paid an electricity bill since 1996." Is that true?
That's when I lived in Colorado. That's an older book, but okay. I was at home in Colorado. Was off grid. Yeah. Now, so I hadn't paid anything in utility all the 10 years I lived in that house. 14 years, I never paid an electric bill. We were totally off grid. Now, when I moved here, we decided to go grid tied with battery backup, and we have multiple solar systems and on different buildings, and we're pretty self-sufficient. We do have to buy a little electricity in the winter because of heating water for chickens and cattle. That really sucks up a lot of power. But and we were actually pretty much net zero until we got the electric car, and now that consumes a lot more electricity. Mm-hmm. So we do have to buy a little bit of electricity during the winter months to heat and keep that car going.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So what's next on the horizon? What sustainability themed pies are you going to get your fingers into next?
So we built a little straw bale cottage on our property years ago, mm-hmm. and we're getting that ready for a bed and breakfast. We're gonna do a little off-grid bed and breakfast, and it's right down by our pond. It's got a nice deck overlooking the pond, and it's a cute little building. So we're getting that finished up and made to look really, really nice. And we're going to put a little tiny wood stove in there and a composting toilet. And we're going to solarize it. We'll put probably a little tiny battery bank in there so people have lights and whatnot. And it's not going to be elaborate. We won't have a TV or anything in there, but we're just going to build that off-grid Airbnb. When we've been doing a lot of work on chicken coops too, trying to solar power our chicken coops, and that's an ongoing project. How to make chicken coops stay warm in the winter and cool in the summer naturally. So we're working on that. You just never know when I wake up what my next project will be. Right now, we're trying to master this indoor LED gardening, this passive hydroponics, and I've been at that for about 3 years too, trying to figure this out. And there are lots of different ways to do it besides the ones the cracky jars that I showed you, the canning jars. There are lots of ways to do this. So we're mastering that right now. That's one of the things we're doing. We're also doing we're starting to cultivate bees too, just for pollination. Mm-hmm. So we've been let's see, leaf cutter bees, and what's the other one? I never can remember. They're not mason bees. Mason bees. Thanks, Linda. My wife and I started last summer, started growing bees just to pollinate. And everybody knows what terrible shape bee populations are in these days. So we're trying to do our little thing to help pollinate our fruit trees, but also to help pollinate everything else around here. So we're lunging into that with great alacrity.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for answering my questions, Dan. I want to be respectful of your time, but we've got a lot of questions from the crowd.
Good.
And if at any point you we're over time, just let me know and we can wrap it up.
I'm fine. I did want to mention one other thing that we're doing is we're really working for butterflies. We have 60 acres, so we leave big patches of our pasture mm-hmm. in milkweed for the monarch butterflies. Yeah. So we started with a really tiny patch about 3 years ago, and now we've got about a dozen different patches that we just leave. We mow around it, the cows don't touch it, and it's just for the butterflies. And we've had so much success with that we actually each summer we plant our patio with all kinds of flowering plants, and then sit there and watch the hummingbirds and the butterflies dine on that. And the next project we're going to do is we're going to build just some raised bed butterfly gardens on our property, just in strategic locations. So that's another thing we got going.
Cool.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to stay here.
We've got lots. So this first question is from Country Kids and Grammy. And they're asking, we are designing a geothermal earth-beamed greenhouse and are stuck on how to get pre-wired, fresh, carbon dioxide-rich air into the greenhouse in the middle of winter. Any insights in how to solve this problem?
Okay, you want to get CO2 in there. You probably don't need it. You probably really don't need to pump a lot of CO2 in there. They do that in commercial greenhouses where they're really trying to push plant growth. They'll pump CO2 into them. But if this is just a small scale greenhouse for your own needs, there's plenty of CO2 in the air. So you really don't need to do that. That said, the easiest way would be to raise some animals in there. Raise some rabbits, or you don't want chickens in there. It'll destroy your chickens in a cage, but I don't like chickens caged up, but they'll so that would be the smartest way to get CO2 into that greenhouse. would be to raise some animals in there if you really think you need it. Otherwise, where do you get CO2 from? Where can you, unless you're buying bottled CO2, how are you going to generate CO2? So anyway, I would encourage you to think about just either some animals or not worrying about CO2. Mostly what we want to do with a greenhouse like that is be sure that the side that's not in the sun, if it's a geodesic dome, is insulated and shaded, because you don't need that north facing glass in the winter. It's not going to help you at all. In fact, it's going to serve as a heat loss. So insulate that north wall as much as you can. And then the other thing that I would recommend, it if you can, and this is going to be tricky in a geodesic dome, is to find some way to insulate your plants. Insulate at night. We use shade cloth that we pull down under the glass at night, just to kind of help hold that heat in. Barring that, what they might consider doing is just putting hoops with plastic over their grow beds, and that'll help maintain warmer temperatures within those grow beds, and they'll have a lot better luck growing in there in the winter.
Okay. Next question is from Tiny House, and they're asking, do you have firsthand experience with passive solar greenhouse in minus 35 degrees Celsius like it is in Alberta today?
No, I don't. But there is one in Alberta. Believe it or not, in my Chinese greenhouse book, there's some data that we got from a Chinese greenhouse book, from a Chinese greenhouse, experimental greenhouse up in Alberta, Canada. And it shows that the greenhouse was 50 degrees warmer in there than it was outside. But I have to caution readers, it was only one day of data. They didn't say whether it was a sunny day. So check around, check on the internet and see if people are doing it. But minus 35 degrees C is pretty tough. I mean, it's pretty tough. You definitely want to have stored some heat from the winter in a deep climate battery, or excuse me, I misspoke. If you can capture a lot of heat from the summer and store it deep underground, insulate the holy heck out of that structure. Be sure it is earth sheltered. Get it down there underground as much as you can. At least the north, not at least, but the north wall and the east and west walls. You want them earth sheltered as much as you can. But I know people in the Rockies who grow in these 4-season greenhouses, and they usually have to heat a little bit during the really cold months. But I haven't had that experience. About the coldest we ever get here is minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. But it would be a challenge to grow in a Chinese greenhouse in negative 35.
Yeah.
C or F, it doesn't matter.
That's
tough.
Basically when they become friends.
Yeah.
Tiny House is also asking, they're interested to know the amount and distance of insulation needed below ground. They're saying that frost can go as low as 8 feet.
Well, what I would suggest in that instance is what we call a frost protected shallow foundation. Rather than I took the insulation 6 feet down in mine. And the idea for that is that you want that thermal mass to be sort of isolated from the ground, okay? And if you're gonna go straight down and you've got an 8-foot frost line, you can go 8 or 9 feet down with vertical insulation. And I'd insulate to about R25, okay? Not R10 but R25. But there is a technique that I discuss in my book called the Solar House, and it's a shallow frost protected foundation. And what they do is they bring vertical insulation down a couple feet, and then what we call wing insulation out from that structure, okay? And you could come out four feet with a rigid foam insulation. So you've got wall insulation, and then down below you've got wing insulation. And it's been very, very successful in Scandinavia. And what it does is it captures heat that's escaping from the earth, and it traps it around the house. And it basically raises the frost line. So you are artificially keeping the earth warmer through the winter. Frost protected shallow foundation. So you're basically creating a microclimate by trapping that heat around your greenhouse or around your home. I did that in Colorado when I built my earth sheltered home in Colorado. We installed that. We installed in parts of it this frost protected shallow foundation. But that's what I'd look into first. Is look into that rather than going all the way down. Do an insulation apron around there, and then a vertical insulation at least maybe 2 to 4 feet down, and then a couple feet down bury a wing insulation, a horizontal insulation, slant it slightly away from the greenhouse so the water drains away from the greenhouse as well. And that'll help enormously.
Awesome.
Good question, though.
Cool. This next question is from Laura Brown, and they are asking, what would you use besides tires? I'm thinking cinder blocks.
Yeah, you could use cement blocks. They need to be filled. For thermal mass, you need to fill them with concrete or sand because a cement block doesn't have a lot of mass. Mm-hmm. So if I were to do it again, I'd either pour concrete, pour probably a 6-inch concrete wall, or cement blocks. Like she mentioned, you'll need to put a footer down for cement blocks, and you probably don't want to dry stack them. You probably want them mortared and you want them filled. And the other option are these things called bin blocks. And I don't know how else to explain it, but they're monster cement or concrete blocks that are made at concrete factories. When a truck comes back with surplus concrete, rather than dump it out, they pour it in these forms and form these massive concrete blocks. And they're they vary in length up to 6 feet, but between roughly 4 and 6 feet long. They're a couple feet wide and 2 or 3 feet, 2 feet high. And it's a big block, kind of like a Lego. It's got a ridge on it and on the top, and then an indent on the bottom, so they can be stacked like Legos. Mm-hmm. And they're fairly cheap. They sell them. It's basically waste concrete, so they sell. They're really inexpensive. The problem comes in moving it. Transportation is kind of expensive, but if I were to do it again, that's what I do. I go to one of my local concrete suppliers. I get a friend with a 1-ton pickup truck, and we go get 2 or 3 or 4 of them at a time, and then use the tractor and just stack them around to form the exterior walls of that greenhouse. It go very, very quickly and provide an enormous amount of thermal mass.
Yeah.
So besides rammed earth tires, I would definitely look at those 3 options.
Cool. Thanks for that. Tiny House has a lot of questions. There's 2 more. They'd like to know your preferred glazing, and if you're growing inside your home with hydroponics, are you having any issues with pests, molds, or humidity?
Okay. I like polycarbonate. 3 and 4 wall polycarbonate's my preferred glazing material. On a ordinary greenhouse, I really like the poly-reinforced polyethylene. That stuff's amazing. I built a small greenhouse when I lived in Colorado, and it was really sort of somewhere between a cold frame and a greenhouse, and kind of bigger than a cold frame, but not quite as big as a greenhouse. And it was designed because we had such a short growing season. We lived at 8,000 feet above sea level, so we basically had June 1 to August 30, the end of August. That was it. That was our grow season. And I like to get things started earlier. So I built that, but I used that. It was 8,000 feet above sea level, so a lot of UV. And I used that, I think it's 11 mil poly reinforced poly. And what it is it's polyethylene. It's treated with a chemical that makes it resistant to ultraviolet light, but it's reinforced with polyethylene fibers, sort of like ripstop nylon, but they're spread farther apart. So if you get a puncture, it doesn't rip wide open. I like that a lot for hoop houses and structures like that. But for my Chinese greenhouse, I use the polycarbonate, and I use the 3 wall, which so it just has a single, or the 2 wall, so it just has a single air chamber in that. If I were going to build a Chinese greenhouse in your climate, I'd use the polycarbonate that had at least 2 air spaces in it. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 wall polycarbonate. That's what I'd use up there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are some really expensive materials. There's one called ETFE. It's basically a relative of Teflon. Fantastic for Chinese greenhouses if you have an arched roof, but outrageously expensive. I mean, outrageously expensive. So I look into that, but that's pretty steep. Now, I have to mention too, just backtrack a little bit. When I was talking about my preference for polycarbonate, I built a sloped roof. I didn't use an arched roof, build an arched roof on my greenhouse. Polycarbonate wouldn't work so well with that. You'd probably want to use, it's rigid. You probably, we just framed ours with 2x4s, pressure treated 2x4s. And that's something I'd use too as well. And be careful inside because of the humidity. You want to use a pressure treated lumber or a cedar, something that's resistant to water. But you know, if you're going to have an arched roof, look into a product called Solar Wrap. It's basically bubble wrap. I think it allows like 84% transmission, and it's really works really well on a angled or a sloped roof, not a sloped roof, but a arched roof. So that's another product to look at as well.
Cool. Thanks for that.
Sure.
And yeah, are you having any issues with pests, molds, or humidity with your in-house growing?
No.
No, that's great.
Now, we have a baker's rack. It's a 6-foot rack, about 36 inches wide, 18 inches deep. We have 2 of those set up, one in the bedroom and one in our spare bedroom. And the only time we've had any insect problems is when I've grown it in soil in containers. Like if I use an organic potting mix from Miracle Grow. It's an organic container soil, and we get bugs from that. We get bugs. But what I found is I've just hung up over those plants. I've hung up a big yellow sticky strip, hung it on the rack above it, and it's caught every single one and eliminated that problem.
Yeah.
So we have indoors, we have no problem whatsoever with mold or insects. That's one of the nice things about it. No weeds, no insects or mold. The only issue again is and my friend Vic from Happy Leaf, he's had the same problem. When he started growing indoors in soil, he would get little bugs. They call them compost gnats. I'm not exactly sure what they are, but they're little gnat-like insects. And it was a real problem with him because that's all he was doing. He was growing indoors in soil containers with soil. Now mine, I had a couple containers with soil. I got one with tomatoes and one I was growing some spinach in, and there were enough bugs from them that they were landing in my other plants. And so when I started to hang those yellow sticky cards, it really took care of the problem. On their own, without the soil, I don't think we've ever had any problems, any insects show up. So it's been really good. We do have an issue that we bring plants in from our patio. We bring them indoors. We put them in the living room, and we've got some kratom growing in there, and some other plants, and they came with their bugs, but they haven't gotten to our indoor hydroponic growing systems. But it should not be a problem. In fact, on the new book Vic and I are working on, we were going to write a chapter on insects, and we're both going, well, it's not a problem. There's just no sense in writing a chapter on pest control. So we mentioned where it's been a problem and how we've addressed it.
Awesome. Someone's asking, what was the name of the shade cloth you mentioned, and what's your experience with thermal blankets for the Chinese greenhouse?
Well, the name of the shade cloth is Aluminet, Aluminet, Aluminet. You can buy it online. It comes in various sizes. You can have it custom made, just more expensive, or you can buy it in certain sizes, and it's got a cloth or a material border on it with grommets in it, so you can hang it really quite easily. There is another one called TICS. It's short for Tempa Interior Climate Screen. We use the Aluminet, same product basically. What it is it's a polyester UV coated, this one's a UV coated polyethylene, but it's aluminized. It's got silver it's silver coating. And basically what it does is in the summer, it acts as a shade cloth. It acts as a mirror. It reflects some of the incoming solar radiation. And you can get it in different densities. We bought 30%, you can get 50%. I'm not sure of all the numbers, but you get it in different amounts of shading. So if you're in a really, really sunny environment, you might want to buy the product that's designed for 50% shading. Yeah. We have good sun, but we just went with 30. So that's that product. And what was the other question? No, what I was going to tell you is, and then in the winter, we bring it down over the greenhouse at night. It's on the inside, it's suspended on the inside. We bring it at night because most of the heat loss from a greenhouse at night is infrared. It's heat waves. You've got the heated water, you've got soil that's heated, the floor is heated, and that the long wave radiation escapes through the glazing. And this illuminant acts as a mirror that reflects that heat back down. So it actually does double duty. It cools the greenhouse in the summer during the days. And then in the winter, we pull it down at night to hold the heat in. And the second part of that question was, have I had any luck with thermal blankets? No, the Chinese, if you go online, you'll find the Chinese initially, and maybe to this day, still use an external blanket. They when they first started developing Chinese greenhouses, they made these massive rolls of straw that they were able to blankets. They rolled down on the greenhouse and rolled them back up at night, but they were on the outside of the greenhouse. And then they switched to using synthetic materials again on the outside. I don't like an external blanket on a greenhouse, especially if you've got snow, because there are going to be days where you've got it down and it snows and you won't be able to get it up. Yeah. So I do all my screening on the inside.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Where are you, and where are you located with your greenhouse?
Oh, it's fully functional. We did all the finish work this year. It's fully functional. We're still learning, as anything, we're still learning how to operate it. We're learning. Our biggest challenge right now is insect control. That's the biggest challenge, and keeping it cool in the summer. But it's a fully productive greenhouse. We're learning what grows where in there, and we're doing some hydroponics in there, but almost all of it is aquaponics and soil. And we're just in the process of learning how to make it work really well, and what we need to do to keep it working really well.
Awesome.
And we provide food from that greenhouse to our farmers market in the summer, and we just have an abundance of food in the summer or in the winter from that greenhouse for ourselves. So that's where we are.
In Missouri, correct? As well? In Missouri.
What's that?
You're in Missouri.
Yeah. We're at 38 degrees north latitude, about 70 miles west and south of St. Louis.
Okay.
It's farm country.
Yeah. So we got 3 more questions for you.
Sure.
Someone is asking about having a mushroom growing room in the back to produce carbon dioxide. Do you think this is a viable option, or what are your thoughts on that?
You have what growing in the back?
Mushroom growing room in the back, and some mycology stuff. Yeah.
I suppose you could do that. And I don't know much about growing mushrooms, but they give off CO2. Is that the presumption here?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Again, I don't think you need the extra CO2 in the greenhouse. There's plenty there. But yeah, that the way you build these greenhouses, you get a copy of the book, you realize that I'm going to try to do this with my hands, but this is the glazing on the front. The north roof is solid. It's an insulated roof, conventional roof, insulated. Ours is 12 inches thick, packed with insulation. Then we have a metal roofing on it. So the back of the greenhouse is fairly shaded. And depending on the length of that roof, you could build a fairly shaded area in there to grow mushrooms. So it'd be fairly easy to do. We store things toward the back of the greenhouse because even in the winter, it doesn't get much sunlight. So yeah, that might work.
That's a neat idea.
Give it a try, and then email. Let me know how it works.
Cool. Allison Butler is asking, what thermal mass do you recommend having regard to the limits of cost and in zone 4?
All right. I like natural mass as much as I can. You can't, I mean, so that's why we use the rammed earth tires. They're basically discarded tires. They've outgassed all that crud that you smell when you go into a tire store. You don't have any of that. I like them because we're basically using a waste material, and they're packed with dirt on site. So each tire, when you get done, is 300 pounds. So it's a lot of mass. And then I like clay plaster, earthen plaster over the surface of that. It makes a really good thermal mass. Now, that said, as earthen materials aren't as dense as stone or rock or concrete, they're about 30% less dense. So they're from a physics standpoint, they're not as, they don't provide as much heat storage as would concrete. So if you have no objections to pouring concrete, that would be one of your best bets, is to pour concrete or use those concrete blocks. They call them bin blocks. You'll see them. I don't know if you guys have them in your part of the country, but anytime you go by a landscaping company where they're selling different kinds of decorative rock or compost, they'll have these big concrete bins, and they're just made out of these cement blocks. Now that I mention it, you'll see them everywhere. I never saw one until someone told me about it, and I realized my neighbor's got some. So they're all over the place.
Cool. We've just had one more question sneak in, and then I've got my own final question.
All right, cool.
What brand of wind turbine would you use or recommend to power the fan for your geothermal or climate battery?
Well, we don't use a wind turbine. We have a little solar system. It's DC direct. So what they are, they're little recycled, repurposed 50-watt modules that we set up on the south side of the greenhouse. When the sun hits them in the morning, it sends that direct current electricity to these little fans. And we're using two types of fans. We're using those dash fans, those silver dash fan. They're 24-volt dash fans that you find, people mount on their dashboard of their tractor trailers. And we mount those on posts over the plants, so it blows air directly on them. And then we're also using some inline fans. They're used for boats. They're designed for boats, and they're 24-volt DC, and it's a plastic fan, very, very powerful fan. We use those to operate that underground storage system. So we have one of those fans that actually sucks air out of the pipes in the ground, and that pulls air in through the pipes up above. So I like those inline fans. And last summer, I mounted some of those inline fans really high in the greenhouse, and they take that hot air and they blow it down on that mass wall in the back. So I've got 3 of those set up that are doing that as well. But it's all DC power. It's all DC powered, and it's all solar powered. So I would generally recommend you installing a small solar system on a Chinese greenhouse like this to provide some of that supplemental electricity.
Cool. All right. Now, last question is from me.
Okay.
Hypothetical situation. You have just been made the Minister of Education, and it's your job to get every high school graduate to read 1 to 3 books upon graduating. So which books are they and why? So it doesn't have to be 1 to 3.
1 to 3. I'd rather you ask, what should we be teaching in high school? Because I've been thinking a lot about that. I mean, I have a YouTube video, and it's entitled "If I Were Asked to Do a TED Talk," and this is what I tell you. And it basically is a talk about how, if we understood some basic principles of sustainability, how ecosystems sustain themselves, how that lesson, I mean, just understanding how ecosystems operate and how they sustain themselves. This is the important thing. What are the built-in mechanisms that have evolved over millions and millions of years that will keep an ecosystem fairly constant, barring major geological change or climate change? Why are they so stable? What goes on in those systems, and what can we learn from them? So I would say that go see that video. That would be, I've broken it into like 4 or 5 parts, but it's little sections that say, here's this principle of ecological sustainability. That's really critical to understanding how nature sustains itself and how we could use those brilliant ideas to fashion our own society.
Yeah.
I mean, nature is the master of sustainability. That's what evolution has created. It's created all these ecosystems with methods that permaculturalists know all about that help sustain it, make it resist change, return to the normal state, maintain populations, keep from polluting and overpopulating, to the destruction of those environments. So I'd recommend that. I know it's self-serving, but I don't make anything from it, so it's not self-serving. Go see that, because I keep thinking that every kid got that lesson in middle school, maybe elementary school, and then learned it again in middle school and then in high school. This world would be a very different place. We wouldn't be talking about owls versus jobs. We wouldn't be saying, oh, we have to, drill oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, because we'd say, no, we know how to tap into natural energy, naturally available, clean, renewable energy. We know how to do that. That's what nature's natural systems are based on. And that's the economy of nature, is renewable resources. So I think that would be an important book. I found, these are older books, but Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb was a mind-boggling book, and but it's quite out of date now. Limits to Growth, the Donella Meadows book, was outstanding. That really helps you understand that there are indeed limits to growth, and that's something we don't get. We don't, as a society, we don't seem to get that. They had a follow-up book called Beyond the Limits, which argued that, well, they were wrong. We were already beyond the limits. That's kind of an eye-opening book. I would recommend people, more than anything, read about solutions. Read about how we can live more self-sufficiently. I wrote a book called Survive in Style, and it's designed for preppers, but it's basically 40 years of what I learned about self-sufficiency. How do you become water self-sufficient? How do you become self-sufficient in terms of energy and food, your own health? I mean, how do we wean ourselves from this costly, misdirected medical system that we have that's all about treating symptoms? How do we wean ourselves from that? So health self-sufficiency, if you would, transportation self-sufficiency, and economic self-sufficiency. If people could do nothing else, becoming more self-sufficient, creating your own resources naturally, making your own food, relying on renewable energy, recycling and composting, all that stuff, when multiplied by millions and millions of people, could have a huge impact on our future. It's something we can all do. So I know I'm sort of struggling around here trying to figure out what books to read, but I clearly would take a look at a book like that. It doesn't have to be mine, but any decent book on self-sufficiency or living off grid will help you understand what you could do, even in your apartment in New York City. If you're living in an apartment in San Francisco, there are things that you can do to help create a sustainable future.
Awesome. And where can people go watch these YouTube videos? Do you have your own YouTube channel?
Yeah, I have a YouTube station, or channel. They can go out and just go into YouTube and type in my name, and it should show up along with some other videos. And I've got a video on turning your lawn into a edible landscape. Just don't mow, grow. Don't be
Yeah.
mowing the grass. Get something to grow there that you can eat. And there's a bunch of others on there as well.
Awesome. Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy and cool life to chat with me and answer a lot of questions. I'd love to know when your Airbnb is set up so I can come
Okay.
check.
Yeah, we're thinking about as a feature when you come to the Airbnb, I'll spend an afternoon with you. We're just touring all the things that we've done on this farm to prevent erosion and build soil and tap into renewable resources. So that would be kind of a, you don't get just to stay here and fish or swim in the pond, but you can also get a tour of the place. So we'll let you know.
Yes, sign me up.
And it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Dan. And I'm sure I'd love to talk to you in the future. So we'll see you then.
Okay.
All right.
You know my number.
All right.
All right. See ya.
Bye, Dan. Thanks so much.
Take care.